Guys, you know there's a moment in every cover-up when the lies become louder than the truth, right? And in September 1988, those lies began in the Maasai Mara. A young British woman disappeared inside one of Africa's most famous wildlife reserves, and within days, her body was found burnt, cut apart, and dumped like evidence someone wanted erased. And I know, honestly, this should have been a murder investigation. Instead, it became a performance. This was a script written to mislead, confuse, and protect powerful men. First, they said lions killed her. Then they said it was lightning. Then they said she had unalived herself. And these three explanations, each more ridiculous than the last, and none matching the evidence. None matching the clean blade cuts on her bones, none matching the fire that someone deliberately set, and behind those contradictions was a fear nobody wanted to name out loud. What if the truth led straight to the doorstep of the president's inner circle? For over 35 years, two governments, Kenya and Britain, have insisted there was no cover-up. Yet every time the trail pointed upward, evidence disappeared, witnesses were intimidated, reports were rewritten, statements were buried, and the one father fighting for answers found himself facing a wall built by people far more powerful than a grieving parent should ever have to confront. This is not just the story of Julie Ward's murder. This is the story of how a crime becomes a political problem, and how a political problem becomes a secret that lasts for decades. But before the politics, the cover-ups, and the courtroom battles, we must go back to who Julie was, all right? Because understanding her life is the only way to understand the scale of what was stolen. Julie Ward was not a spy. She was not a diplomat. She was not a person moving in dangerous circles. She was just a 28-year-old woman from England who worked in publishing. She loved wildlife. She carried her camera everywhere. She saved up her own money to see Africa the way many tourists dream of. Not from a tour bus, but up close, on the road with dust on her boots and a lens in her hand. And in February 1988, she left home for a 6-month journey across the continent. It was the kind of trip people plan for, in years, but rarely gather the courage to take. But Julie did. She traveled through Morocco, Algeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Cameroon, Zaire, or now the DRC, She stayed with local families, slept in basic camps, rode on buses packed with strangers who became her friends, and wrote letters home filled with stories and photographs she could not wait to develop. Along the way, she met a biologist from Australia, Dr. Glenn Barnes. Both of them shared one goal: to witness and photograph the wildebeest migration in Kenya. By mid-1988, guys, they reached the Maasai Mara, the final and most exciting stop of Julie's journey. To understand Julie's last days, you must understand the Maasai Mara in September. It is not just a wildlife reserve. It is a global attraction, a critical pillar of Kenya's tourism economy, and the pride of the government at that time. A scandal there did not just threaten Kenya's reputation, it threatened the Moi's regime political stability. And that context will matter later on. Anyways, let's go back to September 2nd, 1988. Julie and her traveling companion, Dr. Glenn Barnes, arrived at the Mara Serena Lodge. They had spent months on the road, and this was meant to be the highlight of their journey. The Maasai Mara, remember guys, as we said in September, the height of the wildebeest migration. Their vehicle, a small white Suzuki Jeep they had hired earlier in Kenya, had already been giving them problems. It finally broke down on a track near Serena Lodge. The issue appeared to be the fuel pump, okay? A mechanical failure that wouldn't fix itself in the middle of the Mara. And this is where details will matter, because Glenn left. But he did not leave because of the car. He left because of two reasons. First, he had had a work-related commitment waiting for him in Nairobi, something he could not postpone indefinitely, okay? And then he needed to take the faulty fuel pump back here in Nairobi, where he could have it replaced and bring the new part back to the Maasai Mara or send it there. To Glenn, this made a lot of sense, and there was nothing to be scared of. I mean, the lodge was safe, all right? There was staff there who were familiar with tourists. And then Julie had camped all across Africa and had navigated far more challenging environments on her own. Staying behind at the Serena Lodge wasn't unusual. It was very practical for her, all right? On the morning of September 4th, Glenn boarded a scheduled flight from the Mara airstrip to Nairobi. Before leaving, he and Julie agreed once he returned with the repaired vehicle, they would continue their photography plans and wrap up the trip together. And so Julie remained at the Serena Lodge, waiting, maybe resting, sorting her gear, and maybe reviewing the photos she had taken. She was not stranded. She was not afraid. She was an experienced traveler who had crossed the Sahara, ridden riverboats in West Africa, and handled unpredictable journeys with patience and confidence, all right? By September 5th, the replacement part had arrived from Nairobi. Lodge mechanics worked on the Suzuki, and by the following morning, September 6th, the vehicle was operational again. Julie now had one short errand to run, collect the camping equipment she and Glenn had previously left at Sand River Camp, a site deeper inside the reserve near the Tanzania border. This was routine. They had been moving around the Mara, and their equipment was still stored where they had last camped, okay? She expected to drive there, collect the gear, maybe take a few photographs along the way, and return to Serena Lodge well before evening. Around midday, on September 6th, Julie got into the repaired Suzuki and began her journey towards Sand River. There is nothing unusual about this. Tourists drove themselves around the Mara all the time, especially experienced travelers like Julie. At approximately 2:30 p.m., a Kenya Wildlife Service ranger by the name David Kandulan Choko, a revenue clerk stationed at the Sand River Gate, encountered Julie on the road. They spoke briefly. According to Nchoko, she appeared calm, in good spirits, and nothing about the interaction suggested danger or distress, okay? That ranger, David, became the last confirmed person to see Julie Ward alive. When Julie did not return to the lodge that evening, no one panicked at first. In the Maasai Mara, especially in the 1980s, people often drifted off their expected schedules, Photographers in particular would stay out longer if the lighting was good, if they needed good lighting for their photos, or if the animals were active, or if they decided to camp at Sand River to catch the sunrise the next morning. To the staff at Serena Lodge, it was not unusual. They simply assumed Julie had chosen to spend the night at the campsite where she and Glenn had stayed before. Back in Nairobi, Glenn also was not alarmed immediately. He knew Julie's habits, he knew her confidence, and he understood the rhythm of the Maasai Mara, how one small decision can shift an entire day. He expected her to either call the lodge, send a message, or show up in Nairobi after completing her plans. When none of that happened, he thought perhaps she would be delayed by the weather, by wildlife blocking the road, or by mechanical trouble with the same Jeep they had just repaired. All of those things were common. But as the hours passed and she still hadn't returned, people began to feel that something was not quite right. People were not panicking, but a simple practical concern that her plans might not have gone the way she expected. Then one day passed, and another, and by the third day, the silence no longer made sense. By September 10th, 4 days since the ranger had last seen her at 2:30 p.m., the hope that this was simply a delay finally collapsed. What had started as mild uncertainty hardened into real fear. That was the moment when everyone, the lodge, Glenn, and the authorities, had to face the same unsettling truth. Julie Ward was missing. And so, on September 10th, 1988, the official missing person report was filed. The moment the missing person report was filed, everything changed for the Ward family in England. When Julie's father, John Ward, got the call saying Julie is missing, he did not sit down, he did not ask for more details, he did not wait for another update. He made one decision on the spot. He had to come to Kenya. Imagine that flight. Hours in the air with nothing to hold on to except questions. Was Julie stuck somewhere with car trouble? Was she hurt and waiting for help? Had she lost her way in the reserve? Or was it something much worse? John later said that during that flight, he made a promise. He would not leave Kenya without knowing what happened to his daughter. He landed in Nairobi on September 12th, just 2 days after she was reported missing. He did not rest, he did not slow down, he went straight to work. The Kenyan authorities had started some basic checks, but John did not wait for their process. He hired a small Cessna plane and flew directly to the Maasai Mara to search for Julie himself. He had barely been in the country a few hours, yet there he was, looking out of a tiny aircraft window, scanning the endless plains for any sign of his daughter. A car, a reflection, a shape that did not belong in the jungle. He wanted something, a sign. And people who met him at the time remember him clearly. He was not panicking. He was not confused. No, he was very focused. He was a man who had already decided that nothing would stop him from finding his daughter. Over the next 2 days, more people joined the search. Local pilots offered to help. Rangers shared what they knew. Staff at the lodge, retraced Julie's movements and pointed out her likely route. Everyone understood that at this point, every hour mattered. And then, on September 13th, just before midday, one of the pilots spotted something white shining near a river, all right? They flew lower to get a better look. It was a vehicle, a Suzuki, a white one, just like Julie's. John asked the pilot to land immediately. As soon as the plane touched the ground, he ran towards it, and there it was, Julie's Jeep, partly stuck in the mud, doors closed, no signs of a struggle, no sign of Julie. The vehicle told John one clear thing. Julie had reached Sand River. She had made that journey alive. And after that point, something happened to her. The area around the Jeep was quiet. Too quiet, guys. No footprints, no scattered belongings, nothing to explain why the car was abandoned. Just an empty vehicle sitting in the middle of a huge, silent wilderness. John and the search team spread out, calling Julie's name, checking the bushes, the riverbank, anywhere she might have gone. Hours went by with nothing. Then, around 4 p.m., John walked into a small open area. At first, it looked like someone had lit a fire there before, just a patch of burnt ground. But when he moved closer, he realized it was something else entirely. It wasn't a campsite. It was a crime scene. In the ashes, he saw part of a human leg, a jawbone split into 2 pieces, a clump of hair. John knew immediately what he was looking at. He recognized the dental work, and he knew immediately this was his daughter Julie. In that moment, the fear he had carried since he got on the plane became real. But instead of collapsing, something inside him switched. He understood instantly that this was not an accident and nothing about it was natural. This was not the lions. This was not lightning. This was not an accident in the bush. Someone had hurt his daughter. Someone had cut her body. Someone had burnt her remains. This was murder. And from that moment, John Ward, a man who had never done police work in his life, stepped into a role he never thought he would need to play. He became his daughter's investigator. He became her voice. He became her fighter, the one person who would not be pushed aside or silenced. But almost immediately, he realized something strange, Instead of the police treating the scene like a murder. The people around him seemed unsure. They also seemed a bit distant and very uncomfortable. John expected a full investigation to start right away. I mean, guys, I'm telling you, this is my daughter right here. This is my daughter. This is her. So he was expecting move with speed, you know. All right? Then, instead of officers arriving, you know, collecting evidence or taking the statement, the opposite happened. In those first hours and days that passed, the people who should have been searching for the truth seemed more focused on controlling the story. And John could feel it. Something was not adding up. The Kenyan police took his statements, okay? They took the photographs, but their tone did not match what he had just seen with his own eyes. John had found clear signs of violence, you know. There were cuts on the bones, you know. There were remains that were scattered. Anyone could see this was not nature. Yet soon after the discovery, the first explanation started to appear. The first story was that lions had killed her, all right? The authorities said wild animals must have attacked her, dragged her body, and left the remains scattered. John listened, but he knew immediately that this did not make sense. Lions don't set fires, do they? Lions don't make clean cuts on bones. Lions don't burn bodies. When he pushed back, the second story came. They said maybe Julie had been struck by lightning. That explanation made even less sense. The burns on her body were from fuel. What lightning? The cuts were sharp and deliberate. What lightning? And the weather that week had been clear. So you can't say, Ati, there was lightning. And then, guys, as if that was not enough, came the third story, the most painful one a parent can hear about their child. An officer suggested that Julie had taken her own life, that she had somehow cut up her own body and set herself on fire in the middle of the bush. Guys, no evidence, no logic, nothing to support it. Just a theory that felt like an attempt to close the case quickly without asking hard questions. For John, this was the moment he realized he was not just fighting for facts. He was fighting against a narrative that was being shaped right in front of him. Different stories were being floated, you know, tested and repeated. None of them explained the injuries. None of them explained the fire. None of them respected Julie or the truth of what had happened to her. But the question that bothered John the most was simple. Why were these stories being pushed at all? Instead of focusing on the evidence, it felt like people were trying to guide him towards explanations that protected the image of the reserve, the tourism industry, and possibly other interests he did not yet understand. And it was during this period that John realized something else, all right? Something far more troubling. If he did not fight for the truth, no one else would. And so, even while grieving, he started pushing. He met officials, he asked for reports, he pressed for forensic examinations, he questioned every inconsistent detail. And with each question, he could feel something resisting him, you know, a kind of quiet wall, because behind the calm faces and official statements, there was fear. Fear of what the truth might reveal, fear of who might be implicated, fear of what a fully investigated murder in the Maasai Mara could mean for Kenya's political and economic stability. John did not have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Someone was trying to steer this case away from the truth, and he wasn't about to let that happen. So the next step was obvious. He needed proper forensic answers, you know, real science, real experts, you know, not rumors and not guesses. The first forensic examination by Dr. Adel Yusuf Shaka on September 15, 1988, 3 days after John arrived in Kenya, a Kenyan government pathologist named Dr. Adel Shaka examined Julie's remains. Dr. Shaka was the first professional to look at the evidence properly, and his findings were clear. Julie had clean, sharp cuts on her bones, the kind made by a blade, not an animal. Her body had been burnt using fuel, not by lightning or wildfires, okay? The burning happened after death as an attempt to destroy evidence, and according to him, this was murder without question. Dr. Shaka told this directly to Julie's father, John Ward. He did not hesitate. He did not soften his words. He said what the evidence showed. And to John, this confirmed everything he already suspected. But this truth did not last long, because 1 week later, on 22nd September 1988, a second pathologist entered the picture. And this is Dr. Jason Kaviti, Kenya's chief government pathologist then. He took over the case and issued a new official post-mortem report. And this new report looked very different from what Dr. Shaka's findings had found. Instead of stating clearly that Julie had been murdered, Dr. Kaviti's report downplayed the sharp cuts, suggested some injuries could be animal-related, and avoided using the word homicide, all right? Decades later, during a British inquest, a UK coroner described Dr. Kaviti's report as a deliberate falsification, all right? In simple language, the science said one thing, but the political pressure pushed a different story on those papers. This was the first big sign that the truth was being reshaped, all right? John refused to accept the rewritten version of the events. He knew what Dr. Shaka had said. He knew what he saw at the scene. So he decided to bring in outside help. In October 1988, he flew in two British experts. This is Professor Austin Gresham, a top forensic pathologist from the UK, and a second British forensic specialist whose work supported Gresham's findings. Their conclusions matched Dr. Shaka's original report. Julie had been cut up with a sharp blade, similar to a panga or machete. Her body had been burnt deliberately using petrol. The scene had been staged to look like something else. This was no accident, no animal attack, no suicide, all right? 3 separate forensic voices pointed in the same direction. Only one, the official government report, tried to point somewhere else. Why would a pathologist change a murder report? This is where facts are now going to meet context, okay? In 1988, Kenya was under President Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi, a period where speaking against powerful people or embarrassing the government could have serious consequences. You people, if you remember Moi's rule, then I know majority of you even start to shiver, all right? So can you imagine what a murder would have done? A murder inside the Maasai Mara, one of Kenya's top tourist attractions. That was going to threaten our economy. It was going to touch on our tourism revenue, Kenya's international image, and potentially powerful figures connected to the region would be implicated. John did not yet know whose interests were being protected, but he could now see how they were being protected, okay? A clean murder finding had been softened. Blame was being redirected, and the science was being reshaped to fit a safer story. This was no longer just about Julie. From this moment on, John realized he was not only fighting to find his daughter's killer, he was fighting a system where officials changed reports, investigations hesitated, evidence was treated loosely, and the real story seemed to be handled like a political threat, all right? He did not know the full picture yet. He did not know which names were involved. He did not even know how far the cover-up went in Kenya and even in his own country, Britain. But he knew something very simple. If he stopped pushing, this case would disappear. And John Ward was not about to let his daughter's murder be washed away by politics or fear or convenience. So, in 1990, something was happening in Kenya. Pressure from Julie's family, the British government, and the public finally pushed the Kenyan authorities to take action. After months of hesitation, they arrested and charged 2 junior Kenya Wildlife Service employees who worked inside the Maasai Mara National Reserve. These people are Peter Kipin, a junior warden responsible for routine patrols and basic wildlife management duties. And then you have Jonah Mageroi, who is also another junior warden who worked alongside him in the same area of the reserve. These were low-ranking officers. They did not make decisions. They did not manage the reserve. They answered to senior officers above them, especially to the chief warden, Simon Ole Makala, who was the top authority inside the Mara at the time. You know, he was there at the time Julie disappeared. Now, Kipin and Mageroi were essentially the easiest people to accuse. They were present in the Mara that week. They were junior enough to be blamed without political consequences, and charging them allowed officials to say, we are doing something without touching anyone higher in the chain of command. Their trial began in Nairobi and lasted almost 4 months. During the trial, something became very clear. There was no strong evidence linking these 2 men to Julie's murder. Their names did not appear in any meaningful witness statements. Even the physical evidence did not point to them. And it started to look like they had been accused simply because someone needed to be blamed, and these 2 men were the safe suspects, all right? In June 1992, the judge delivered his ruling. Both men were found not guilty. But what the judge said next is what shocked everyone, including Julie's father, John Ward. The judge openly stated, if these 2 are not guilty, then the guilty ones are still out there. He added that other people in the Maasai Mara knew more than they told the court. And he went even further. He suggested investigators should look up the chain of command, specifically towards the chief warden of the Maasai Mara himself, Simon Ole Makala, all right? For a Kenyan judge in 1992, during the Moi regime, to say that out loud was such a big deal. It was a warning, a clear sign that the truth was higher up, not lower down. After the acquittal, the case should have moved forward, all right? Investigators should have followed the judge's advice. But that did not happen. Instead, files went quiet, leads slowed down, and nothing meaningful was done for years. John did not give up. He kept asking questions, writing letters, meeting officials, and repeating the same point over and over again. Why are you only arresting junior staff? Why are you not investigating the people in charge? All right? Slowly, and only because he refused to stop, the pressure began to work. In 1997 and 1998, these are like 10 years after the murder of his daughter, all right? Kenya was going through political changes. Moi's long rule was being questioned more openly, and there was more space to re-examine old cases. It was during this period that the authorities finally arrested the man many people had been pointing to since the very beginning, Simon Ole Makala, all right? The chief warden of the Maasai Mara at the time Julie went missing. To understand why this was important, you need to know Makala's position, all right? He was not a junior ranger. He was not someone answering to others in the reserve. He was the top authority inside the Maasai Mara. He supervised all wardens. He controlled access to certain areas. He had power over patrol schedules, staff movements, and sensitive information. Nothing major happened in the reserve without this man's knowledge. So when locals and even the first trial judge hinted that people higher up knew more, many eyes eventually turned towards this man. His case went to court in 1999 and lasted 43 full days. It was long, complicated, and very tense. But once again, problems appeared very quickly. During the trial, witnesses changed their statement, saying something different from what they had said earlier. Important pieces of evidence were missing, including documents that should have been part of the official file. A Scotland Yard witness statement, which allegedly mentioned that a VIP A very important person had been seen in the area around the time Julie disappeared was not produced in court. There were even complaints about unusual behavior, such as claims that Makala was seen talking casually with court assessors during breaks, okay, which is highly irregular in a murder trial. By the end of the proceedings, the case was clearly falling apart, not because the truth was not there, but because the process itself was not functioning honestly. Makala was acquitted, and the judge summed it up in one painful sentence: nothing added to nothing. In simple terms, there was no real case presented here. Now, to John Ward, this verdict hurt. Not because Makala was found innocent, but because the trial never actually asked the right questions. It felt like another performance, another attempt to show action without touching the real truth, you know. It confirmed three things for him. The wrong people were being taken to court, right? The right people were being protected. The investigation was being controlled from above. At this point, John understood something very important. If the police and the courts could not get to the truth, the problem was not the law. The problem was politics. There were people whose names officials would not say. People the police would not question at all. People who were untouchable. And rising above all those whispers was one name: Jonathan Moi, the son of President Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. Jonathan denied any involvement. He was never charged with anything. He was never put on trial. But from the first weeks of the investigation, his name had been mentioned quietly by locals, by people inside the reserve, and even in statements that never made it to court. His name was just hovering over the case, you know, like a shadow. And the deeper John went, the more he began to understand why. Let me take you back to 1992. A man named Valentin Kodipo, also known as Uhuru Kodipo, made a statement that changed everything John thought he knew about the case. Kodipo was not a tourist, okay? He was not a ranger. He was someone who had once moved in the circles close to the Moi regime. He claimed he had seen and heard things that were never meant to reach the public. By the time he spoke out, Kodipo was living in exile. He had fled Kenya, saying his life was in danger. From exile, he gave a detailed written statement. In this statement, he claimed Julie Ward had been abducted, she had been sexually assaulted, she had been murdered, not by animals, not by accident, not by lightning, but by a group of powerful men. And one of the men involved was a son of Moi, all right? He did not type Jonathan's name directly. No, he did not say it's Jonathan Moi, likely out of fear. But the meaning was very clear. Everyone understood who he was talking about, all right? John Ward later met Kodipo and listened to him directly. He says he found him very calm, consistent, and believable. The details Kodipo described matched the evidence, including the order of the injuries and the burning of the body. But most importantly, his story matched something else: the fear people in the Mara had shown from the very beginning, all right? Rangers, drivers, and the staff who might have seen something were always hesitant, all right? Some whispered privately but refused to say anything official. Others changed their stories later. Some simply disappeared from this case entirely. Fear was shaping that particular silence, all right? And Kodipo's statement explained why. If powerful men were involved, especially men tied to the president's family, then no one in the reserve would dare speak openly, okay? Not in 1988, not under Moi's rule. Kodipo was not the only one. During the first phase of the investigation, Scotland Yard took witness statements in Kenya. One of those statements, the only one that allegedly mentioned a VIP being seen in the area on the day Julie disappeared, somehow disappeared for years. It was only rediscovered much later, raising serious questions. What was it hiding, you know? Who kept it out of the court? Why was this particular statement hidden? And why did it threaten the official narrative? To John, this was not just suspicious. It was proof that the investigators were not being allowed to follow the evidence honestly. What made Jonathan Moy's name come up, all right? Jonathan was known for several things. He loved fast cars, you know, flying and spending time in private camps inside the game reserves. He had connections with security officers and senior officials. And most importantly, he had access to places inside the Maasai Mara where ordinary people could not go without permission, all right? So you get why his name would come up. If anything, he was maybe the only child to Moi who loved this kind of adventure, who was always seen in the Maasai Mara. And obviously, these accusations did not prove guilt, but they explained why his name kept coming up in the background. Even if he was innocent, the fear of implicating him was enough to distort the entire investigations, all right? So reports softened, evidence disappeared, witnesses kept quiet, and three impossible theories were pushed instead, all right? We talked about them: lions, lightning, and Julie having unalived herself. John never said Jonathan Moi was guilty without evidence. What he was asking for repeatedly was very simple. If the name of this person keeps coming up, test him, you know, investigate him properly, clear him or confirm the concerns. But that never happened. Even decades later, when British forensic labs developed a male DNA profile from materials found in the case, John asked Kenyan authorities to request DNA samples from several men, you know, including Jonathan Moi himself, but no sample was ever taken. No comparison was ever made, and over the years, several people connected to the case, especially those whose statements pointed upward, not downwards, not the junior wardens, you know. They did not live enough to see justice. One of the most important person was Valentin Uhuru Kodipo. Kodipo, as we said, had fled Kenya after giving his statement, saying he feared for his life. He lived in hiding in Uganda and continued to insist that powerful men were involved in Julie's death. In 2009, Kodipo died in exile. The exact circumstances around his death have never been fully explained publicly. Some reports described illness, others suggested pressure and fear that had destroyed his health long before the end. What is clear is that a key witness, someone who named a son of Moi and described the events in detail, never returned to Kenya and never testified in open court. He was not the only one lost along the way. Other potential witnesses in the Mara either changed their stories under pressure, disappeared from the area, or died before giving full statements. Now, whether these deaths were connected or simply tragic timing has never been definitively proven. But for John Ward, each loss meant one thing. And you can imagine, according to him, the truth was slipping further away. And then came the final blow to one of the most important unanswered questions in the case. Jonathan Moi died in 2020 at the age of 64. With him went one of the biggest unanswered questions in Julie Ward's murder. Would a proper investigation into his movements and DNA have finally revealed the truth? We will definitely never know, because the test was never done. And to John Ward, that was one of the hardest facts to accept, not because it proved guilt, but because it ended the possibility of ever proving innocence or involvement, all right? That door closed forever. You would expect that if a British citizen was murdered abroad, her own government would go to war for the truth. But in Julie's case, the British government played a far more complicated and at times deeply disappointing role. On paper, the UK supported the Ward family, okay? British diplomats met John, you know. They attended court hearings. They communicated with Kenya officials, you know. But behind the scenes, Something else was happening, something John Ward only fully understood years later on. One of the earliest false explanations for Julie's death was that the idea she had been struck by lightning. You remember? At that time, this seemed like a Kenyan theory. This is a Kenyan theory. By the way, if you look at us, you would think we are the only people who can come up with that theory. Later, evidence would show that a former British police officer working closely with the British High Commission in Nairobi helped push the lightning explanation to John Ward. Why would you do that? Why would you look a father straight in the eyes and tell him his daughter had been struck by lightning, knowing very well you are lying? This officer also had known links to MI6, the UK intelligence service. Why would a British official promote a theory that clearly did not match the evidence? Because political relationships were at stake, all right? In the late 1980s, the UK government viewed President Moi as a valuable ally in East Africa. Kenya mattered, not just diplomatically, but militarily and economically. A murder scandal inside the country's most famous tourism reserve, potentially involving people close to the presidency, was the last thing either government wanted to explode publicly, all right? Years later, during Julie's formal inquest in the UK, that is in 2004, a senior MI6 officer gave evidence behind closed doors. He admitted that, MI6 had monitored the case, had contact with people inside the investigation, and had played a covert role. He insisted the UK was not covering up anything, but that admission alone confirmed what Julie's father had felt for years. His own government was not being fully honest with him. Remember, guys, in 2007-2008, new DNA technology allowed British forensic labs to develop what? A male DNA profile from material connected to the case, as we said. This was huge. It meant for the first time investigators could compare this unknown male DNA to real suspects, okay? Scotland Yard officers were ready to travel to Kenya to continue the investigation, but the UK Home Office blocked the trip. Officially, they said there were there were procedural issues, unofficially, and this was John's belief, the truth was very simple. The British government did not want to risk publicly accusing a former president's son, all right? It would have damaged UK-Kenya relations for years. So instead of helping, the system stalled, all right? Again, the UK Foreign Office also conducted an internal review of how the High Commission handled Julie's case. Some part of that report were highly critical of British officials. And what did the government do? They classified those sections. In 2005, they refused to release them, saying it would cause serious embarrassment. Think about that. A young woman was murdered. Her family fought for decades, and officials were still protecting reputations, not the truth. By the time John put all the pieces together, he realized something very heartbreaking. In Kenya, he was fighting a cover-up driven by fear, power, and political pressure. In Britain, he was fighting a quiet cover-up driven by diplomacy, image, and convenience. Two governments, two systems, different motives, but the same outcome. And the truth was pushed aside. And through all this, John Ward, one man grieving his daughter, kept going because he knew something both governments kept ignoring, okay? A murder does not go away just because people want it to. After the trials failed, after reports were changed, after witness statements disappeared, after both Kenya and Britain quietly stepped back, many people would have given up. But Julie's father did not. He refused to be another parent whose child is written off as an unfortunate accident. He refused to allow Julie's memory to be buried under politics, and he refused to let men in powerful positions decide what version of the story the world should hear. Most fathers would definitely have been grieving at home. John was grieving on planes, in courtrooms, in government offices, in the Maasai Mara, and in hotel rooms where he studied documents late into the night. Over the course of 35 years, John Ward traveled to Kenya more than 100 times. Can you imagine that? Spent an estimated £2 million of his own money, hired private pathologists, forensic experts, lawyers, pilots, investigators. He filed reports in the UK and Kenya, met with presidents, attorney generals, police chiefs, diplomats, pushed for DNA testing, retesting, and proper evidence handling, okay? And he kept every document, every photo, every statement in meticulously organized files. And he also returned again and again to the spot where he found Julie's remains. He became the world's leading expert on his own daughter's murder. Not because he wanted to, but because nobody else was willing to do that job properly. John was not a detective, as we said. He was just a hotel owner, all right? Before Julie's death, he had never dealt with police, politicians, or courts in this way. But grief gives people a strength they never expected. People who met John during those years described him the same way. He was focused, calm, direct, unshakable, and he did not break down in meetings. He did not show anger in public. He did not collapse under pressure. He channeled everything into one mission: find out who killed Julie and hold them accountable, okay? It was not obsession, it was responsibility. The kind a parent feels when the world fails their child. John confronted people most Kenyans feared to speak about. Senior police officers, government pathologists, cabinet ministers, key figures in the Moi government. He did all that. He even did that to President Daniel Toroitich Moi himself. He met Moi face to face and told him directly that the investigation had been mishandled. Few people in 1980s and 1990s in Kenya would have dared to do that. John did it alone, without bodyguards, without political backing, without a government protecting him. Even his own government failed this man, and he did it again and again. By the 2000s, John had collected more than 20,000 pages of documents, hundreds of photographs, statements from dozens of witnesses, forensic reports from both Kenya and the UK. He could recite dates, names, and inconsistencies better than most detectives could. And he noticed errors in official papers that investigators had ignored, He caught contradictions in witness statements years apart. He saw patterns that pointed in one direction, a direction the authorities never wanted to follow. This battle cost John almost everything: his health, his money, his family's peace, his ability to ever fully grieve, all right? And then his wife, Jan Ward, carried the emotional weight beside him for decades. Every holiday, every birthday, every family moment was marked by the same question: who killed our daughter? All right? Their sons, Bob and Tim, grew up watching their parents fight a battle that never seemed to end. John once said he did not believe he could properly grieve until he found the truth, but he never did. But of course, again, he never stopped trying. Even into his late 80s, John was still pushing, still giving interviews, still writing letters, still meeting journalists, still organizing files. And in 2023, he died at the age of 89. His wife, Jan, passed away shortly before him, and they left without the answers they fought for. But they did not leave without impact. Because of John, the world knows Julie was murdered, not struck by lightning. The lies told in 1988 did not stand unchallenged. The contradictions and political interference are part of that public record, okay? A case that should have been buried was instead kept alive for decades. Future investigators, if they ever reopen the case, have a mountain of evidence carefully preserved. And perhaps most importantly, he proved that one ordinary person can force powerful systems to face their own dishonesty. When you look at how this case unfolded, you start to see something very uncomfortable about power. And one of the clearest examples came almost 10 years after Julie was killed. According to investigations published by The Telegraph in the late 2025, the Kenyan government quietly paid 700,000 pounds, that's about 120 million Kenya shillings, to John Ward back in 1997. And this was not announced publicly. It was not even written into any official report. It wasn't even framed as compensation. It was handled quietly, and according to the newspaper, the arrangement was made with the involvement of British intelligence, all right? Guys, the money was meant to refund expenses, all right? The huge amount John had spent flying in and out of Kenya, hiring experts, and basically doing the job the state should have done. Why pay if you are not guilty? Why pay this much money quietly if you are not guilty of something? Anyways, anyone looking at this with common sense definitely sees something very different. This was a government that was trying to soften a painful story, okay? They were there trying to ease the father's pressure, you know, maybe even by a little silence. And the sad part is this, it worked. After that payment, a lot of the noise around the case died down. The push for a new investigation cooled. The public attention faded. It was as if power had discovered a simple truth, that sometimes you don't need to solve a problem. You can simply pay for it to disappear. That's the thing about Julie Ward's case. Once you step back and connect the dots, you realize this was not just a failed investigation. It was a system protecting itself. From the very beginning, the facts were clear. Dr. Adele Shaka, the first pathologist to examine Julie's remains, said it plainly. This was murder, all right? Clean cuts, petrol burns, deliberate destruction of evidence. And then within days, his report was overridden by another from Dr. Jason Kaviti, all right? Who, if you remember, suddenly suggested animals or accidents. And then years later, you have a British coroner who calls the second report a deliberate distortion of facts. Julie's murder exposed how easily justice can be bent when the people involved hold influence, political, economic, even diplomatic influence, all right? It showed how a country can prioritize its image over a family's pain. It showed how a government can rewrite a narrative and hope the world accepts it. All right? Remember, guys, John was even lucky he had this money. He was doing this as a normal person, not a detective, all right? Not some guy who is wealthy somewhere. Not some guy politically connected. He was just a father. And he pushed two governments to confront their own failures. He forced conversations that powerful people hoped would never happen. If John Ward had not pushed, I would not be here having this conversation with you. This man pushed, and we give him that. And I can imagine how hard this was for his family. You know, he kept Julie's name alive when both Kenya and Britain wanted the story to fade. And in the end, he died without the answers he deserved. But he proved something very important. The truth does not disappear, even when money, fear, and power try to bury it. All right? And this is why I had to bring you this conversation today. And we had to start with the story of Julie Ward because there is a dark side to our tourism industry in this country. For the longest time, Kenya has been marketed as a tourist destination. But there are so many things that happen, so many people who lose their lives, including foreigners who are following this tourism tale. And some of them are innocent workers. And I will bring you the story of so many people who have lost their lives in the name of tourism. And people are not just losing lives, people are losing land. People are losing their inheritance, their ancestral homes. And if this can happen to a foreigner, if this can happen to Julie Ward, imagine what happened to people like Brian Odhiambo. Imagine what happened to people like Daniel Mwaniki. Imagine what happened to people like Njogu and Washington. We are glad at least Njogu and Washington are still here. Kenya's tourism sector carries a dark side, and that side must be spoken about. We cannot continue marketing this country as a tourist destination and then turn our eyes or go blind to the injustices that are happening in the name of tourism. If people are going to learn of Kenya as a tourist destination, let them also learn of the dark sides that happen in that particular sector. And that is why this conversation was very important. This is why this story matters today, all right? Because we have to talk about this. We cannot let powerful people, powerful institutions, powerful countries continue covering up the truth. At the end of the day, no matter how much they cover the truth, always remember there's someone out there, a father, a daughter, a journalist, or a stranger who will refuse to look away. And we will not look away. We will not look away. If that happened to Julie, I want you to imagine what can happen to any one of us in this country. All right? And I want to take this moment and dedicate it to everyone that is fighting against this whole tourism BS. People like Mordecai, we appreciate you for opening our eyes to a lot of injustices that are happening in this country in the name of tourism. I don't know if I have definitely added to your knowledge in this matter. I know this is something many of you already knew about. All right? If a president can cover up something like this, imagine what else can be covered in the name of tourism, in the name of protecting this sector. A lot of things matter. And I hope this story matters, all right? So stay tuned. We will be taking a look at personal stories that are affecting natives in this country. And we are going to fight and advocate for their rights. And we are hoping even the ones that are missing until now, people like Mwaniki, I hope they are found. And I hope they are found alive. And I hope one day, if they are alive, they will look back and they will know someone spoke for them, all right? And that brings us to the end of our conversation today. Remember, just because you have money will not bury the truth. You can do whatever you gotta do, but you will not bury the truth. All right? All right? So thank you so much for watching. Let me know your feedback on the comment section. And let me know, apart from Brian, people like Mwaniki, who else would you want us to shine a light on? All right? So let me know what your thoughts are on the comment section. And I thank you for supporting our work. I thank you for subscribing. We are ending the year at almost 1.5 million subscribers. I don't take that for granted. I honestly never thought we would get to this point. It's very hard to run an independent media house. You fight with so many people behind the scenes. But I appreciate your love and support. And I do not take that for granted, okay? So that's it from me today. See you guys next time. My name is Lynn Ngugi. Yeah, see you next time, okay? Bye-bye.